Welcome in, Dween Nation. This is your host, Justin Paez, alongside Genoa Agudelo. Genoa, how are you doing today, my brother?
Yo, Dween Nation. I'm doing good, Justin. I'm so excited to dig deep into this free agency period. We had a couple things happen. We have many more things to come. So, Justin, I'm just so ready to dive. We're talking running backs today, and man, this is a pretty interesting position, Justin.
Yes, it definitely is. And guys, we got a lot to talk about today. We're going to dive into running backs. Last week, we kind of went in depth on our quarterback game. But, along with talking about, running backs, free agency being on the way with, probably one of the most stacked free agent running back classes we've seen in a bit. But another thing that opened as of yesterday was the franchise tag window for teams to franchise tag upcoming free agents, and that's going to be very important for a lot of players. Last year we saw Saquon Barkley, we saw Josh Jacobs, a number of players get franchise tagged. A lot of people don't enjoy the franchise tag, but it's going to happen. It's inevitable for a lot of these players. Now, to dive into those, just to some that are very important, I think, starting with Saquon Barkley, they talked already. The Giants have kind of spoken and said that they don't believe that they're going to franchise tag him. They're going to let him test free agency, which is to the happiness of most of the fans outside of the New York Giants organization. Another guy, T. Higgins, has been talked about being franchise tag, which I could see happen. Do you have any thoughts on if either of those two guys? I know those are two probably the biggest names in free agency.
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at these two guys, these are two offensive playmakers. These are two studs in the fantasy world as well, Justin. Uh, so I don't think Saquon Barkley will be tagged. It's looking a little bit like he's pretty much done with the Giants. I do remember the last game of the regular season. He was pretty much saying goodbye to the fans. I can sort of tell with that body language. Uh, so I definitely think Saquon Barkley's out the door. He might be a suitor to a championship contender that needs a running back out of the backfield. Saquon, with running backs, they have a shorter life shelf, Justin, and with Saquon, he probably has 4 to 5 really good years left, so he's going to want to make the most out of it. Looking at T. Higgins here, I absolutely think they should tag him, and I think they will. When you look at Cincinnati, they have a pretty good core that's so good in fantasy, so good when Joe Burrow is healthy. When you looked at what they even did with Jake Browning, Justin, at the end of the season last year, he was having great games with T. Higgins. I think T. Higgins had a great game in one of the last weeks of the season in Pittsburgh, which you know how tough it is to get going and formerly Heinz Field. So I definitely feel like, Justin, one doesn't get tagged with Saquon and one does in Cincinnati with T. Higgins.
Yeah, and I think, for either move, I think a lot of people in the league are kind of hoping that Saquon finds a new team. But even if he stayed on the Giants, he's still a top, 5 to 10 running back. And T. Higgins, I don't know. I don't know how, in my opinion, how good he really is. I don't know if he could become an alpha receiver if he left and went to Carolina or something like that. There could be, I don't know, he could be kind of exposed if he does such a thing. But I still I like him to stay in Cincinnati. They're in the spot to make another big run, so I think he's going to be a part of their discussions about who they want for their Super Bowl run. Moving on to Michael Pittman, he's a free agent. There's talks that he could be a franchise tag candidate, which, looking at it, the Colts got really nothing else around to throw the rock to, which could be, at Michael Pittman's, his advantage, because they're going to need, to bring him back, and he played very well in his contract year, and so I think he deserves to come back. I think the team's going to want him back. If he were to leave, he'd be a hot commodity because he's pretty young off of his first contract. So
Mm-hmm.
I like Pittman. Wait, let me throw in one more guy with that that is up for a franchise tag. We got Mike Evans, who I think it's important to point out. I think his time in Tampa Bay is coming to an end, just because this past weekend they had a due date, or I think it was Monday actually. They had a due date where they could have extended him, and it saved $7 million. They don't get a deal done, and so now we're looking at Mike Evans hitting the free agent market, which could be, I mean, he might be the hottest commodity, even though he's 30 years old. What are your thoughts on Evans and Pittman if they have any, if they leave or if they stay?
Well, looking at Michael Pittman, this guy still has a lot of years ahead of him. Young man, he's only 26. I do think though he had a great season. He did have over 1,000 yards, only 4 touchdowns. He got hurt in a couple games. I don't think he played a full season. But when you look at what he was able to do with Gardner Minshew, he did have Anthony Richardson, their franchise quarterback, for a couple of games. They did have a new coaching staff. So if I'm Indianapolis, I'm so going to franchise tag Pittman. I feel like when you have a guy like Anthony Richardson, this guy's going to be a potential playmaker. He gives me Cam Newton vibes. I think that eventually he could be a guy that's always in it every year to win their division. Now that you have C.J. Stroud and Trevor Lawrence, whatever Tennessee does, it's going to be a little bit of a tight division. So they're definitely going to need some playmakers all over the field. And I would keep Michael Pittman for sure. If the Colts don't franchise tag him, he is going to be great anywhere else. I would love to see Pittman in Baltimore, actually, Justin. I think he would fit well with Lamar Jackson, that gritty, run and pass motion that the Ravens run. I think Pittman would fit great with the Ravens. He has that motto with him. I think he'd fit a John Harbaugh-led offense. Looking at Mike Evans, Justin, you know how much I love Mike Evans. The guy is a Tampa Bay Buccaneers legend. He's had 1,000 yards every year in a season. However, I would love to see Mike Evans on a contending team. I feel like any of the contending teams in the AFC, I feel like that, with Buffalo and Houston, teams like that, and even Kansas City, Mahomes might want a new weapon. He wants to win with other weapons. I feel like he's going to want to have a great MVP year, lots of scoring, lots of offense. So Mike Evans is going to be hot wherever he goes. What if Philly gets him? Someone with even a good amount of receivers still might get him and pay the money for him. Mike Evans is an absolute beast. I feel like he still has 2 to 3 years with him. When you look at what he did this year, Justin, it was very impressive to see what he did with his first year without Tom Brady and with Baker Mayfield, who I did not have Baker Mayfield having a great season at all. I thought the Buccaneers were going to be, the top 3 in the draft order picking in this year's draft. But Mike Evans was able to kill it, man. Unbelievable for him. Unbelievable season for him this year. He was 9th in receiving yards, which is very impressive. Looking at here, he had about, I believe, 13 touchdowns. And so Mike Evans is going to be great anywhere, but I do think he's going to be at a contending team. Look for Buffalo. I would say maybe look at the Chargers as well, and also look at Houston. So Mike Evans is going to be a hot target here in free agency.
Yeah, and I think, with him heading out of town, I know Baker Mayfield is a free agent, but the Bucs already talked about bringing him back on a a solid deal to be their starter for next season. I'm just putting this out there. I know we're talking about franchise tag players, but your take about the Bucs being one of the worst teams heading into last season, I think if you just keep with that take next year, I think there might be one of the worst teams heading into next year. They lose Dave Canales, their offensive coordinator, their offensive guru. Levante David and Devin White are free agents. Mike Evans a free agent. Baker Mayfield's a free agent. Maybe some teams are going to learn, Rashad White's what his weaknesses are more, because he didn't play too much his rookie season with Leonard Fournette there. He did have some moments, and then he had a big year this past year. And so I think that team is kind of in a limbo where things could definitely take a sour turn, especially with Arthur Smith's not on the Falcons anymore, and they get Raheem Morris, and hopefully a better quarterback. And then on the Panthers, they get Dave Canales and maybe a sophomore bump for Bryce Young. So Tampa Bay is on a watch where I'm a little concerned. I never thought Todd Bowles was a great coach. We've talked about that. We don't think he's that great of a head coach. So if he, if him inheriting the next season having a worse team, this could be a dangerous waters for them. What are your thoughts on Tampa Bay in the South? And then we'll move on to the performance reviews.
Yeah, I don't really like him in the South. I feel like if Mike Evans were to leave, it leaves, Godwin all by himself. I do like New Orleans to make a little bit of a push next year. And you gotta believe with Carolina, they're gonna make, some type of push with Dave Canales. I believe he's the head coach there now, Justin. And now looking at Atlanta, I love Atlanta with Raheem Morris, like we mentioned. If they can get a Justin Fields or just a great quarterback out the draft, I love that offense with, Drake London and Kyle Pitts. And you know how much I love Bijan Robinson, Justin, out of the University of Texas. Atlanta has a little bit of a solid defense. I do think they have Jesse Bates still under contract for a couple more years. Raheem Morris is a defensive-minded coach. So if I had to pick right now my favorite for the NFC South, I'm going to go with Atlanta just because of their star-studded offense and the potential of Raheem Morris. But I do like New Orleans creeping around there, but definitely I'm not a big fan of Tampa.
Yeah, and that division is already pretty weak. So they you can't really fully count them out until we start seeing them on the field. But they're definitely not looking great. But now, actually, before moving on a little bit more into our Dween Sports Daily News, Dak Prescott in a year or two is due for an extension, and there were rumors coming out that he might be asking for $60 million a year, which is pretty wild in my opinion. He's not regarded a top 5 quarterback in the league, in my opinion. So what are your thoughts? If they were, would you think they have to pay him or, let him leave?
Well, Justin, you're going to have to pay him. But here's the trickiest part. What are you going to do after this year with CeeDee Lamb and Micah Parsons? Their rookie contracts are coming up around the corner. These guys are stud. When you look at Micah Parsons, this guy has the potential to win Defensive Player of the Year eventually. I feel like when you look at guys like Max Crosby and TJ Watt and Nick Bosa, Micah Parsons is one of those guys that are on the list as one of the best defensive players in the league. He's going to want a mega contract. He is a star, just like his helmet, like what it is on his helmet. So you got to look at that as well. On the other side of the football, who Dak is going to be thrown to. CeeDee Lamb had a great finish to the season, absolutely winning fantasy league championships. Justin, in that week, that final week of the season against Detroit, I mean, he had a marvelous game. You got to believe that number 88 is so special in Dallas. You got to pay him too. So it's going to be tricky going into the season with the Dallas Cowboys. They are going to be a top team for sure. Always a favorite to win their division. But, now if you're Dallas, you have to look at yourself and see what can we do this year with Dak. If we can get a playoff two or win a playoff game or two or even make it to the NFC Championship game, we can see what we can do with Dak. But it all comes down to this year, Justin, and what they can do to get closer to, going back to the Super Bowl because it's been about 30 years now. And, it's now or never for the Dallas Cowboys. So it has to be depending on what happens this year. Obviously, in the NFL, you need a quarterback to win the Super Bowl. As we just saw these past 2 years, we had the best quarterback win the Super Bowl back-to-back years. So if you're Dallas, you are going to have to pay him, but you're just going to have to see what you have done at the end of the season to pay your two big guys in Micah Parsons and CeeDee Lamb.
Yeah, and it's hard. I mean, some of these teams, though, they're playing a little scared. I mean, I know Miami's talking about extending Tua. Like, he's clearly not, to me, a Super Bowl type of quarterback. I feel Dak probably falls in that boat, even though I know he's better than Tua. But, like, some of these guys that just a lot of teams feel, connected to and tied to wouldn't be me. But one more thing, actually. Us here at Dween Sports, we are on the Justin Fields watch, trying to figure out where this guy is going to land. It's back and forth. Today, I actually saw a hint that the team might want to keep him. But then you saw the interview. I'm pretty sure you saw it on the Amon-Ra St. Brown and Equanimous St. Brown's podcast. They were like, "Why'd you unfollow the Bears?" Which Fields did yesterday, and he was like, it means nothing, essentially. I mean, his quote was pretty funny. I don't remember the exact quote. Something about, even though I don't follow the girl, doesn't mean I'm not messing with her. So he's definitely, I don't know. I don't think he's in the light as much as what the the organization's doing. I think we here are pretty convinced he will be shipped out somewhere. We talked about the Steelers last episode. And then, honestly, a couple of days after, there was a report saying that they think they're going to let Kenny Pickett have one more season. So the door might be shutting there. And then, of course, these last two teams that I like to bring up. The Falcons is his hometown in Georgia, which he could come back home to. He even talked about it on the podcast, saying that they have, great weapons there, which it's interesting that he got to talk about them specifically. And then he talked about, playing for his hometown, all the people he's going to have to bring to the games because of family and stuff that live there. And then the last team is the Raiders that have kind of been jumbled in here, which I don't see that happening. Last year we saw Lou Getsy, who was the offensive coordinator for the Chicago Bears. Obviously, he got fired. Now he's the offensive coordinator for the Raiders. And we never saw him, unlock Fields last season. In fact, I think Fields kind of digressed a little. And so I don't know if there's any bad blood there, but why would you want to? I know Fields doesn't have any control over that, but if for Lou Getsy, if he doesn't think that his offense can mesh with Fields, why would you want to bring him in? What are your thoughts on either of those two teams? Where would you rather him go?
Justin, there's a good amount of teams. I think you make a great point for the Vegas Raiders. I don't think he should reunite with Getsy. He's a little on and off as a coordinator. So here's some other teams that are interesting to me right now, Justin. Obviously, we mentioned the Steelers, which looks like it might not happen. We've talked about the Falcons. If Justin Fields were to return home, that'd be an interesting trade if that were to go down. But here's one team that's very interesting to me, Justin. How about Seattle? How about Seattle with a defensive coach who can take care of defense? And you look at that offense, Justin, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Jackson Smith and Jigba, and that backfield with Zach Charbonnet and Kenneth Walker. Why not have Justin Fields go there and change life in Seattle, where now I believe in the NFC West, that division's wide open. San Francisco just lost the Super Bowl. We're not sure how they're going to react. The Rams had a great finish to the season, made the playoffs, but is Stafford going to be able to keep them in? Kyler Murray and the Cardinals, we're not really sure if they can be a top team in that division. So if you're Seattle, you're thinking, we just hired this new coach that was a great defensive coordinator in Baltimore, and now we have the pretty good offense. Geno Smith hasn't really given us what we wanted to. We made the playoffs a year ago. This past year, we couldn't really, get to the playoffs. So how about we make a trade and get Justin Fields? Justin, on this offense, wouldn't Justin Fields be a top 7 fantasy quarterback if he were to go to Seattle and be throwing the ball to guys like Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf?
That's actually really very interesting landing spot you mentioned. Seattle has all the goods that they could possibly want. Mike McDonald, although he's a defensive coordinator, he had worked, the last few seasons with the Baltimore Ravens with Lamar, running quarterback. And Washington University's head coach is now, their offensive coordinator is now the OC for the Seahawks. We saw that offense be very explosive. So I think that's a very, very interesting move. And I think Seattle could pull the trigger on that. They don't have to give up a first, and they don't have to use a first on a quarterback to have a guy that could be, set in, day one with that win now roster. So that's a good point. And yeah, so that's Dwayne Sports Daily News for this episode. Now we're going to dive into the thick of what we really want to talk about today, which is our running back performance reviews. And we're going to follow that by some free agency predictions as well. So let's start out. We're going to start from the top like we did last week. The RB1, undeniably, not even close, was Christian McCaffrey, CMC. We can roll through this guy pretty fast. We saw him just be absolutely dominant all season long. He is phenomenal. Touchdowns every week besides I think one. So he's totally amazing. What are your thoughts on CMC? I know we talked about the Niners, last week, but is he, set up for success again next season?
Yeah, you have to believe it. The 49ers for me are a little up and down, but I want to be confident in Christian McCaffrey. We all love Christian McCaffrey. It was very unfortunate that the 49ers couldn't have pulled it off in the Super Bowl. Would have loved to see Christian McCaffrey with the Super Bowl ring, Justin. However, going into next year, you got to believe that Christian McCaffrey is the number one running back. This past year, Justin, he is the reigning offensive player of the year with 21 touchdowns as a running back. Total touchdowns. It's crazy, especially in that offense where there's so many mouths to feed. Christian McCaffrey was still able to lead the lead in rushing and have 21 total touchdowns. There's no doubt that he is the number one running back of this year.
Yeah, and he's just the receiving work is phenomenal, and the offense he's on is phenomenal. So he's great. He's clearly the RB1 heading into next year, even with some injury concerned, but who isn't really injury concerned? But yeah, so moving on to RB2, the hottest, waiver wire pick of the season. Some could say him and his teammate Puka. It's Kyron Williams. I mean, what a season he had. He was injured for 4 or 5 weeks with
Mm-hmm.
the ankle injury, but still ends as the RB2 on the season. He was getting all the work for the Rams, all that work, and he was phenomenal. I think he's clearly their franchise running back, and so I'm going to have him up here again. Do you have any concerns with Stafford's age or any of they might pass him more with now Puka being more established? What are your thoughts on Kyron?
Absolutely not. When you look at Sean McVay, who he has kept the Rams relevant when we thought they weren't. Going into this past year, we thought the Rams were going to be so boring to watch. How wrong were we? Coming off the first week of the season, Puka had like 11 catches to start the year. That offense is so much fun to watch, and they're going to have another year under their belt, Justin. I love Kyron Williams. He is easily the running back, too, going into fantasy next year, Justin. There's many great wide receivers that you'd pick over Kyron Williams. So if you're picking 7th or 8th and Kyron Williams falls in your lap, you've got to take him. This guy's going to be a stud. You mentioned he did miss 6 games. He played 12 games, and he finished 3rd in rushing with 12 touchdowns, Justin. And that is just ridiculous. This guy was, as we both know, he won a league. He won our main league, really. Literally brought someone in our main league a fantasy championship. So Kyron Williams is a stud. He is running back number 2 next year in fantasy and in the NFL. That Rams offense is so much fun to watch, Justin. And when we talk about wide receivers here next week, I cannot wait to get into Puka. I mean, these are 2 really interesting players to go along with Cooper Kupp and Matthew Stafford in Sean McVay's offense. So I'm definitely high on Kyron Williams next year. If he can fall to like the 7th or 8th in ADP next year, I mean, you have a stud to start your fantasy drafts. Definitely love Kyron. Very impressive year, and he is on my big-time likes for 2024.
Yeah, looking at him, you're like, he's kind of small, but he's kind of built. So, if you look at his stats, too, in every game, but looking at 3 of his games, he didn't have over 20 touches. That is phenomenal. He's getting, ultimate workhorse usage. And I think it's funny that you mentioned he did win our fantasy league. I think it's funny. I really want to mention this to the audience. Me and Genoa here, we're in a ton of leagues, but we have a main one. And there was a deal. I had Kyron. I scooped him up. I was ready on the waivers. And I make a deal to get Tyreek, who was the best player in fantasy at the time. It caused some reactions in the league because Tyreek's the best. Kyron, it was actually still on IR, and obviously there was more players involved on the Kyron side. But hey, I ended up losing. Tyreek slowed down. My team slowed down, but the guy that gets Kyron wins it. So be active on trades. Sometimes it doesn't look like it's going to be a good trade at first, and then it does. It's all about forecasting. Injuries show up anytime. For me, I'll be honest, I thought I had it too. I was like, Tyreek, he's the best player. I had A.J. Brown at the time too, who was just coming off his, record-breaking, weeks. It all came down, though. It all came crashing down. There's some luck maybe involved at who you decide to grab because there was no, signs of Tyreek slowing down or, the rest of the team. So it's definitely it's funny how fantasy football works. I guess that's what I'm trying to share. But yeah.
Yeah.
It was definitely funny. We had some conversation.
Very, very intense conversation.
Very intense.
That's how it is when you're in fantasy league with your friends and people that you know, and money's involved. So
money's involved. Now I got the stigma that I'm a bad trader, but hey, he won. That's all I'm saying. He won. No, but anyway, all right, we're gonna move on to the RB3 in fantasy last year. This is in points total scored. Okay. This was Breece Hall for the Jets. Obviously, he is an absolute star. It's what he was, what he set in. Him and Garrett Wilson were set without Aaron Rodgers all season, stuck with Zach Wilson, and, Boyle, whatever his name is, and Simeon. It was just painful to watch. I'm not even a Jets fan, and I was, hurting watching that, even though I was a Breece Hall owner. The good thing for Breece Hall was he was immense. He was just getting all the receptions. They would just pass it out to him. That was how he was getting a lot of points. I mean, for what is it looking like here from week 6 to week 15, he didn't have more than 50 yards rushing in a game. And sure, those weeks weren't like super pretty, but it really all culminated at the end of the season. He had 37, 23, and 33 to close out the year, kind of boosting up his numbers, because I wouldn't have seen him as the RB3 on the season, but he really saved it. And if you were able to pass that first round where he stunk it up against Miami, you probably won a championship. So Breece Hall, I mean, with Aaron Rodgers, back and healthy, I'm very excited about him. His yards per carry weren't great, but I'm really hoping that the Jets address offensive line in the draft and maybe in free agency as well. I know they have the 10th overall pick. So yeah, what are your thoughts on Breece? I mean, I absolutely love him.
Yeah, I feel like once Aaron Rodgers got hurt week 1, I feel like the motivation for Breece Hall sort of went downhill, just because he expected to be with Aaron Rodgers, and in the next couple weeks he was able to pick it up. And I love Breece Hall going into next year. He gives me Nick Chubb vibes, Justin, where he's able to take one to the house out of 50 or 60 yards. And this past year it surprised me how he was able to get catches out of the backfield, which is very good if you're a fantasy owner. Looking at the Jets next year, you got to believe that they are going to make a push now going for the playoffs. When Aaron Rodgers comes back, you got to believe he's going to be healthy. He's going to be 100%. They get all these playmakers for Aaron Rodgers. And I like Robert Saleh as a head coach. I think he's a pretty solid coach. Breece Hall had many flashes this year. And he was 6 yards short, Justin, of 1,000 yards, which sucks because we all love Breece Hall. Looking at here, he had 5 rushing touchdowns. Not too beautiful, not too amazing. But you got to believe that next year he's going to have a better year, just because, the Jets now expect Rodgers to be back. And I feel like that team will be all ready to go. The Bills are a little bit, on and off. Could be, not really sure what they're going to do. New England, it's And with Miami, they're beatable, I feel like, even though they have a pretty great offense. So, Breece Hall is definitely a running back to look into if you're in the second round. If you can get him at the end of the second round, that's a steal, Justin. But he's going to be really good, I feel like, next year. So I'm not down at all on Breece Hall. I don't think this year changes my view on him. He's a wonderful player, and he should be great going into next year.
Yeah, and I'm actually gonna rebuttal you. I think he could creep into late first in 12 teams,
Mm-hmm.
maybe be that turning the corner type of player.
Mm-hmm.
Just because he ended the season at near the top, and I think he's gonna be even better next season. But yeah, so I like Breece Hall, what he's got to offer. And so yeah, he's great. Something that he'll be up on draft boards. Hopefully Nathaniel Hackett doesn't limit that offense too much.
Mm-hmm.
But with Aaron Rodgers, the sky is hopefully the limit. But yeah, moving on to RB4, kind of the wonder of the NFL season. Raheem Mostert lands right here. He had 21 total touchdowns. Absolutely, just crazy. The Dolphins gave it to him a ton. And I think we could both agree. I mean, I've been posting for Dween Sports and the Fantasy Spark for all this season, and this guy was on my trade away list every week because I'm always scared he's going to get injured. He didn't get injured, but I still have that stigma around him that he's going to get injured, so I'm out on him next year. What are your thoughts on Raheem?
Yeah, I agree with you, Justin. In the past couple of years in San Francisco, Raheem Mostert would never finish NFL seasons. He would miss about 7, 8, 9 games in a row. Guys like Elijah Mitchell and like Jordan Mason would show up before they had gotten McCaffrey in San Francisco. Mostert surprisingly played 15 games this year, but here's my biggest worry. Here's one. Last year, 2022, the touchdown leader was Jamal Williams for the Detroit Lions, Justin. He goes to New Orleans this past year and plays about only 8 games. I don't think he went over like 300 yards rushing all season, Justin. That concerns me for this year's leading touchdown rusher. Secondly, Justin, when you look at Raheem Mostert, he's a great back, but there's someone on that depth chart in Miami who you're very familiar with, Justin, and Devon Achane, who showed when he was healthy, Justin, he was putting up absolutely big-time running back 1 numbers. I think he finished once or twice this past year, Justin, in running back one numbers for fantasy. I think one game he had like 55 fantasy points. I think it might have been that game against Denver. I could be mistaken.
50-point game. Yep,
That
yep.
70-point game by the Dolphins. So here's the thing, Justin. In that dynamic Miami offense, you got to believe that A-Chain is the future. I don't think they'll continue with Jeff Wilson. I think he's a cut or wave candidate in Miami. So you got to look at the potential of A-Chain. Obviously, if A-Chain is playing with Mostert, there's going to be a limit to Mostert's carry. It concerns me. And Mostert's been around for a while, Justin. So we're not really sure how much he has left. And, and Devon A-Chain, he's going to be a sneaky fantasy pick. I'm very interested to see where his ADP is, Justin. So there's many things to go on. And I also feel like Mike McDaniels and that offense, they usually have somebody new every year. I feel like Mostert was not around in 2022. We hardly ever heard of him. He was always hurt. So, it's a little bit of a concern. But Mostert had great games, but I feel like he sort of went downhill at the end of the season. Justin, I hardly heard from him, but I'm a little down on Mostert going into next year for sure.
Yeah, he's going to be 32, I think, heading into next season. He stayed healthy this year, which is unlike him, like we mentioned, and you definitely need to rope in A-Chain. For the viewers who are like, is it A-Chain or A-Chain? Even when he was at A&M, we thought it was A-Chain, so you call him what you want, I think. But A-Chain, I'll go with A-Chain because that's what I heard him say. He definitely is kind of roped into this conversation. He, to me, is probably hands down the biggest risk and reward type of player because he also has injury concern. He missed a handful of games this year as a rookie. He's just a smaller back, and getting hit, could cause a lot of things. But his explosiveness, we saw that, and essentially his first game that he was really involved with the team. He put up 54 points, 200 yards, 4 touchdowns. He's a special talent. And so he's right up there in the third round, probably just because of that injury risk. If he wasn't, maybe if he was a bigger back or something, he could be a first rounder in my opinion. So, I do like A-Chan. Mostert's kind of the opposite. Even though the last 2 seasons, I didn't think Mostert would do anything. And he was still, even in his first season with Miami, when we thought it was going to be Chase Edmonds, he came out as being the lead back, and then same for this season. So, Mostert, cautiously pessimistic is where I'll take my action on there. But yeah, moving on to the next guy, a guy that started off very hot, it was a touchdown machine early, fell off a cliff. I guess same with the rest of his team. It's Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars. I kind of see that this season kind of modeled what the prior season was, where he came on after he took over James Robinson's role, and was scoring and scoring and scoring, and then things kind of just fell apart, and he became less efficient and didn't score those touchdowns that we saw earlier in the season. There's a stretch of 3 games he had 6 touchdowns, so it was 2-2-2, which is just phenomenal. And he was the RB1, I believe, through week 8. And then after the bye, he didn't score. He had 1 game higher than 15 points again. So it's I'm at a point where he could be a good pick. He's still, 3rd, 4th rounder, kind of where he was last year. But I don't want to rely on him to be my RB1. So if you're trying to do hero RB, trying to get that one guy or a zero RB, I don't think he's someone to jump on. Do you have any thoughts on what he could look like next year based on how we saw him this year?
I like Travis Etienne for another great year. Like you mentioned, he had a great start to this year, and then he did fall off the face of the earth. Justin, he barely got over 1,000 yards, which through week 8, it looked like he would have probably almost went to 1,600 yards, maybe the league leader. Right. But he played all 17 games this year, didn't miss a game. So it's pretty sad for him to finish below expectations. When we're thinking Travis Etienne, we're thinking maybe 1,300 yards. This was a guy who was a league winner in 2022. He had great games to win leagues as Jacksonville made that playoff run a year ago. I guess you got to give some responsibility and some blame to Trevor Lawrence. He did struggle at the end of the year. him unable to find Calvin Ridley every other game. It seemed like there was many issues. So I don't think it was just a Travis Etienne thing. I think it was mainly an offensive thing. Offensive, I think they just weren't clicking towards the end of the year. And I guess it's the reason why Jacksonville, they were leading the division over Houston and they ended up losing and not even making the playoffs at all. So when you look at what Trevor Lawrence and Travis Etienne, I'm gonna go ahead and believe in Travis Etienne next year. I believe that the Jaguars are going to be better next year. With Doug Peterson, who knows so much about offense, who's won a Super Bowl before, you got to believe that he's going to have his offense ready to go now. With Calvin Ridley being a year out of the suspension, so the Jaguars are going to be better going into next year, and I do believe Etienne has a bounce back season.
Yeah, maybe so. I mean, he has the goods. I mean, you could see it on the field. He's got bursts and he's got those explosive plays in his arsenal. Let's just see if Jacksonville can utilize him to his strengths. But yeah, moving on to the next guy who will not probably be on the team that he's been on for so long heading into next year. The biggest back in the NFL, Derrick Henry, lands himself at 6. I mean, he's now going to be 30, I believe. But he still had, I mean, behind a bad O-line, he didn't look as he did in prior seasons. But I don't think he's washed yet, Derrick Henry, and he still had, a handful of good games, a handful of bad games as well. He did have some games where, that one game against Houston where he usually dominates, he only had, 16 carries for 9 yards?
Yeah.
10 yards total on 20 touches. So he's definitely, he's not Derrick Henry of, a handful of years ago, but he's still Derrick Henry. I mean, compared to the rest of the league, he's still a top back. But I think we're going to jump into this a little later with where his landing spot could be in our free agent predictions. But I think he's still got some gas in the tank. It depends where he lands. The handful of teams, Baltimore, Philly, Dallas, all have kind of been, brought up as a possible landing spot. Do you think Henry could, if he's in one of those situations, could be a top 5 running back, top 3, top 10?
I would say top 10. I think Derrick Henry, whichever team he goes to, is going to have sort of that Gus Edwards goal line work. There's many teams that he can go to. If Saquon probably doesn't stay, maybe Derrick Henry goes to New York. Maybe, Justin, there are a lot of different teams he can go to because running backs is so dime a dozen. There's so many different running backs can go here, can go there. A team that does, kind of interest me is maybe New England. With Gerard Mayo as the head coach now, you got to believe that he gives his team something like of a young spark. They're going to need some talent in New England. It's looking very rough on that roster. There's a lot of teams that have their solidified running back. Teams like San Francisco and the Rams and Buffalo. Even teams like Detroit who are stacked. But maybe he could go to Dallas. When you look at the Cowboys, Pollard did have an 1,000-yard year. It didn't feel like it. But Pollard only had 6 rushing touchdowns, which is a little concerning. Maybe you can blame the loss that the Dallas Cowboys had to the Green Bay Packers is to the lack of running game. So maybe, Derrick Henry could go to Dallas. I like that. Maybe be a workhorse compared to Tony Pollard, who's a speed back. There's many teams now, Justin, that have 2 backs that are pretty good. Even when Nick Chubb comes back next year, they're going to have him and Jerome Ford, and who knows if they bring back Kareem Hunt. So, maybe he can go to Baltimore where Gus Edwards, can be, a good compatible with Derrick Henry. I do think Derrick Henry is going to have a pretty decent season. If I had to predict stats, I'm going to probably say he has 800 to 900 yards rushing and maybe about 7 to 8 touchdowns next year. I just believe whatever team he goes to, there's going to be like another running back with him. So maybe if he goes to like a Buffalo and teams up with like James Cook, or like goes to Philly and teams up with a speed back like DeAndre Swift. So I see something like that for Derrick Henry. Now going into this past year, he was able to overcome some poor issues. He had Ryan Tannehill, and then he got hurt, and then Will Levis came in.
Right.
And then the Titans were never really competitive. But Justin, he had his longest rush of the year was at 70 yards, which is pretty impressive behind that terrible O line with 12 touchdowns and second in the league in rushing yards. So pretty impressive if you're Derrick Henry and if you're Super Bowl contending team who just has a speed back like Philly, like Buffalo, and even like maybe the Rams. You could have Derrick Henry, collide, combine with those two running backs and see what you have in that offense.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Definitely is something to chew on out is where he will land. I think. Well, at the end of the episode, we're both going to give our predictions on who we think will sign Derek. But moving on to the next guy, a guy that honestly last year we thought probably wasn't going to be on the team. There was talks about him being a cut casualty. We got Joe Mixon landing on here for the Cincinnati Bengals. He is clearly past his prime. I think we've seen just efficiency has gone down, kind of held up by some big games. He was a little bit more consistent through the back half of the season. Never too big of booms. There was 2 weeks where he had some big games against the Jags and against the Browns in week 18. But our seasons were already over for fantasy. So he I want the Bengals to find someone new. I know they have something in Chase Brown. I don't know if he's a workhorse back. He's definitely has catching ability. So if he were to have a expanded role, he could definitely be a good flex option. Depending on who else they bring in to kind of carry the early download. But Chase Brown, I like him. I think he's a receiving back more, not a 3-down back. So if Mixon stays, I don't love it. I'm not gonna jump on him, even though he's on a good team. And their O-line should be improving even more. I think they're gonna address that in the draft again. So yeah, do you think Mixon? What are your thoughts on Mixon?
Yeah, it's really hard to say, Justin. Joe Mixon is getting up there in years. He did have 1,000 yards rushing. He did play 17 games, with 9 touchdowns and eighth in the league in rushing. So it's hard to really pinpoint where Joe Mixon, how we feel about him going to the next year. I do think he'd be a great like 5th or 6th round pick in fantasy drafts. Um, Chase Brown had some really great games. He might be their Eckler, maybe potentially, even though Eckler had a pretty bad year. But I feel like if you're Cincinnati, you're obviously going to have to roll with him. Like I mentioned last episode, we're going to have to, if you're Cincinnati, keep this core together and just build offensive line because Joe Burrow now in his career has had 2 season-ending injuries, which could have had, who knows if Cincinnati, if they had Burrow, they probably could have made a playoff run and to challenge those Chiefs and Ravens. And so, you definitely got to roll with Mixon next year if you're the Bengals. Like I said in fantasy, maybe get him as your 3rd running back. We're not really sure what we're going to get from Mixon, but he's been very consistent the past couple of years, Justin. So I just say you roll with him until the tires fall off, kind of like how the Cowboys did with Ezekiel Elliott until he can no longer go. They finally let him go. So I guess since, Mixon did finish 8th in rushing this past year with Jake Browning to finish the season, Jamar Chase was hurt a couple good amount of games, and so was T. Higgins most of the year towards the end. So, you gotta go with Joe Mixon and believe that he's gonna have a good season going into this year.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. That's a different take than what I was thinking, but definitely something that the Bengals might be interested in. I am interested in the fact that if they got to bring, they got to bring a guy like T. Higgins back, maybe Tyler Boyd. If they're spending a lot of money, they might have to, cut out some stuff. I know they restructured his deal last offseason, but if they can do that again or something like that, he might be a cap casualty too if they can't do that. So I definitely keep a watch there at the Bengals running back room. I don't think he'll return to being a top 10 running back again in fantasy. So yeah. Now moving to, I believe this is number 8. This is Rachaad White, who I can be totally candid. Thoughts as we both spoken, our thoughts on the Buccaneers weren't very high. But Rachaad White exceeded all expectations, I think, by just about everybody that could have thought about it. even though to me, I mean, it was kind of right in front of our faces. He was by himself in that backfield, but we just didn't know how good the Bucs offense would be without Tom Brady and with Baker
Mhm.
Mayfield, and so we missed that. And he had just a phenomenal season. I mean, after week 6, he had one game under 10 points after that. I mean, it was just the label of consistency. He was getting catches and he was getting that run work because nobody else could have challenged him. I mean, what they had Sean Tucker, Chase Edmonds for a while, Keyshawn Vaughn, just no names I mean, Rachaad White played very well too. I mean, I'll give him his credit. Played a lot better than the back I thought he was. Which leaves me, I think the Bucs are gonna he's their guy for now. I don't know if they're gonna address it with a big name, try to bring a backup in. So I think he's set to have another year of a lot of usage. I don't know. I think his efficiency will go down with worse offense with no Mike Evans,
Mhm.
no Dave Canales. So he'll probably roam around RB 15 to 20 for me. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point that you mentioned. That now that Dave Canales is gone, how do we view Rachaad White now? Because, you know, their last year with Brady, it was a mix of Fournette or Rachaad White, and they weren't really sure who they were going with. I know that was a different coordinator with Byron Leftwich. Um, with Rachaad White, it's really tough to tell. I'm not going to go out of my way and pick him in the second or third round. If he's around the fourth or fifth, sure. But you got to believe, Justin, he is going to be the lead back in Tampa. He had some great plays. He had a great touchdown in Detroit. And he had some good games along the way. He gets catches out of the backfield, so it's definitely good for fantasy. Um, I'm not really sure what to think about it because once again, I'm a little bit down on the Buccaneers, so I'm not really sure. But he could be one of those good running backs on pretty bad teams. So I'm fairly I'm just fair on Rachaad White. It's like I'm good, but I'm not too against him. Like if he falls to me and I have my two good receivers and a good running back, maybe I have a quarterback, but then I guess I go with Rachaad White. It's still hard to just really figure out what the Buccaneers are going to do. Um, but I'm just going to give him the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to go with Rachaad White as a possible top 6 or 7 running back, Justin, just because he gets many catches out of the backfield, kind of like an Alvin Kamara would. And he also scores off them. So, you got to believe, this past year also, he was 10 yards short of 1,000 yards. So would he be motivated going into next year to go over 1,000 as he's never really had that in his career? So, I'm fairly good on Rachaad White. I'm very excited to see what he does next year, though.
And I do think to maybe him getting being more drafted next year. I think a lot of people are going to have the thoughts we are having, just like with concerns with the offense, and that could drop his ADP, which could make him a good value because he will get that usage and receiving work to be a serviceable fantasy and maybe RB2. So definitely another name to watch. I definitely like him over Joe Mixon, just to put some context into that. Now
Yeah.
here to the ninth guy, a guy that I am fairly shocked actually made the top 10. It's Bijan Robinson. For Bijan Robinson owners this past year, including myself in a lot of leagues, I had a lot of belief in the man. It hurt to watch that team just throw in Algier and Patterson, and it was painful. It was painful. A
Yeah.
lot of animosity still towards Arthur Smith. I was definitely on some Instagram X posts being like, fire this guy, please, and they did so, thankfully. Thank you, Dennis Allen, for dominating him in week 18. But anyway, it's a new regime. Zach Robinson is the offensive coordinator there. He was just the quarterback's coach, I believe, for the Rams, who, if you follow some of McVay's schemes, they just had Kyron go crazy, and Todd Gurley a handful of years ago, and so I'm back on board. It's still I haven't forgotten about this past season's work with it's just poor utilization, not just for Bijan, Drake London, Kyle Pitts as well. But I think hopefully it's a new era for Atlanta. And I mean he was just so average in scoring. I just think he had the one playoff game with negative -0.1 points, which probably kicked a lot of people out of the league. I mean, I know in our big league, I had Bijan and Brees Hall was kind of a nail in the coffin when your top two running backs put up a combined of 2 points. So that hurts there. Actually, in another league I was in, I had Henry, Brees, and Bijan all in the same week when Henry played Houston, as we mentioned earlier. So don't let the scars scar you. I think Bijan will be back this next year in Atlanta, and hopefully with a better quarterback too. So, what are your thoughts, Genoa? I'm going to put this out here. Tell me what your thoughts on Bijan, and I want you to answer. Would you go Bijan or ETN next year?
Oh, that's easy. Okay, I'm going to answer your last question first. I'm going Bijan. You know how much I love Bijan out of the University of Texas. I think he's more reliable. Justin, he only finished like 40 yards less rushing than ETN. ETN was on a better offense and possibly a better team. Looking into next year for Bijan, though, I love him. He's going to be a great running back next year. Like I said a couple weeks ago, maybe in our first couple episodes, that Bijan might be a better pick next year than Christian McCaffrey. I feel like, going into next year, obviously Christian McCaffrey is always going to be the better running back, I guess, all time. But fantasy-wise, I love Bijan because I feel like now with Raheem Morris, I feel safe, Justin. I feel like he's going to have Bijan be the workhorse. I'm pretty sure they talked about it in many meetings leading up to hiring Raheem Morris. Like, hey, we have this star running back that we drafted 8th overall this past last year's April's draft, and he's the guy that we need to go to. In the last week of the season, Justin, Bijan had a 71-yard catch for a touchdown, and I just love seeing that. Bijan Robinson was one of my go-to guys this year in DraftKings. I loved having Bijan Robinson. I've always felt that he was going to be a great running back. But going into this year, Justin, I love Bijan Robinson. There's many good wide receivers that we can draft in fantasy, but if Bijan can fall to a 5 or 6 ADP, that would be unbelievable in the first round. I love him. Hopefully Raheem Morris can look at Arthur Smith and not go down that lane. There was a couple games this year where Atlanta was just so weird in how they managed Bijan Robinson. Bijan, he's a great guy with a great character. He's always going to be, positive. He's never negative. He was, I followed him at the University of Texas, watched every game in his final season at Texas. He was such a stud, never complained, was always such a team player. So, obviously he's never going to say anything about it. But, for fantasy owners, he did hurt us, Justin, a lot. I had him in another league, too, where he was inconsistent in our, dynasty league. So, looking, to Bijan, I feel like going into next year, the slate is going to be wiped clean, and Bijan is going to have a top 3 fantasy running back year campaign in the year of 2024, Justin.
That's pretty big. And you said first round you think he'll go. I think at the moment that's kind of a hotter. Maybe he's right around there, around the Brees Hall range. Now I'm thinking about it. And I agree, kind of hopefully a slate that's been wiped fully clean with the new regime there. All right, now talking to the number 10 running back, arguably the most exciting of them all. I understand how he might have been, annoying at the beginning of the year because they weren't utilizing him a lot. But once he missed those 2 games, he was injured for 2 games, came back against Baltimore. From there, he was electric. I mean, and you saw it. You saw it on the field. He was just had so much burst. He became. I mean, like you would think Montgomery's only the the goal line back, but at a point in the season, they were like, we have to give it to Gibbs anywhere and everywhere on the field. Mm-hmm. So Gibbs honestly is right up there in the top 4 to 5 running backs behind. He could be even over Bijan Robinson. I just love everything he's got. He's got the catching ability, and he's just got big playability. So I'm all on the Gibbs, hype train next year. I know Montgomery's still going to be there. They can both coexist just fine. So yeah, what are your thoughts on Gibbs? I mean, he ends with the top 10, even though his average would have put him higher up in the rankings.
Yeah, I love Jahmyr Gibbs going into this year, Justin. I made a terrible trade. I drafted Gibbs in our main league and
Right.
made a trade, and he came back and hunted me and killed me when the Lions played the Raiders on Monday Night Football. Ouch, that still hurts. However, I love Gibbs going into next year. You got to believe now, the second half of the year, he took off. He had some great games, even in the playoffs, had a couple touchdown runs. You got to look at him. The game against San Francisco, he scored a touchdown. And the game against Tampa Bay in the playoffs, he scored a touchdown. Um, and even in the game in the very first game, the wild card round, he had a pretty decent game too, scoring a touchdown. So he scored touchdowns in every playoff game they played. And you got to believe now with the Lions, Justin, it gets interesting now. This is a team now that has high expectations. Now in fantasy, I love every Detroit Lion going into next year. Gibbs, Montgomery, Amon-Ra, love Jared Goff. We all love Sam Laporta, who's the darling of tight ends in the NFL. So going into next year, you got to draft any Lion you can. If you have a chance to draft the Lion, I mean, this team's going to be box office. This team's going to be competing every game with the motivation of Dan Campbell and the way he's so fierce and just so aggressive. Dan Campbell's always going to get the best out of his players. He is one of those coaches that's going to have a good team now every year. And so I love Gibbs next year. You got to believe now going into next year, Justin, he might be the lead back over Montgomery. Just the way they utilized them in the playoffs. It's now, they were very slow with it at the beginning of the year. I think maybe Dan Campbell wanted to test out Montgomery. But Montgomery got hurt a couple games. And so I feel like Jahmyr Gibbs eventually is going to take over. We're not really sure with the contract issues of Montgomery. Is he going to stay? I believe he might be a free agent after this year or next year. I'm not too sure. But eventually Gibbs is going to be handed the keys as full-time running back for the Lions, Justin. It's going to get very interesting what he does. His ADP, Justin, it's very interesting. I'm not really sure where we draft Gibbs. I cannot wait to see how they have him as fantasy drafts start popping up, mock drafts. So that's going to be one of the first things I'm going to look into, Justin, is where Gibbs is ADP and where, people have him going and how they think he's going to be good this year. But he could be a league winner, Justin. I feel like now that he has a second year going to, with the Lions, I feel like eventually he's going to just take over as full back for the Lions.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, that it's going to depend a little bit on I think fans and casual fans and just everybody that's going to play fantasy is going to be very high on what Gibbs can do, just, watching him be so electric on the field. And so if he jumps up too high, it could be, a little bit, but it's kind of warranted just because we think he's going to be amazing. But I think a lot of people are going to think that too. Unlike a guy maybe like Bijan, who, there might be some people that are just like, I cannot draft him after what, kind of went through last year, but he could be just a value right there in that of itself. So that's our top 10. There's a lot more names that we will cover. We'll have ranking episodes and everything like that. So there's names that are on this list that are just are going to be very important for next year. We're going to go very deep into that too. But that was the top 10. That's the end of our performance reviews. And now we're headed to arguably my favorite part of the episode. It's time to make some predictions on some running backs. Free agency is right around the corner. NFL Combine is next week, which I'm going to put that out before we start. We're going to have a second episode this week, everybody. So please, this is our announcement for it. It's going to be a mock draft for the NFL draft that's in April. We're going to have our first one out. It'll be 2 rounds, and it's going to be super fun. We're going to go back and forth talking about, who we think, is going to go, Caleb Williams, where he's going to go, Malik Neighbors, all the way down. And so we're going to talk about, maybe a couple running backs that could creep into day 2. I don't know if any's going to be in day 1, but we'll dive into that on Saturday more and maybe a little bit today. But let's dive into some free agency predictions. We're going to start with the top guy, who we mentioned a little bit earlier, Saquon Barkley. We don't think, or we'll both hold our opinions, and I'll start first. My prediction, he's going to be a Houston Texan. It's going to happen. I'm looking at it. I'm looking at what they need. Texans reports have come out, and they said that they want to bring in a strong, a reliable running back that could take some stress off of C.J. Stroud. The Texans have money. It just seems like a match made in heaven. I'm looking at, who they could, bring in. They could keep, Singletary. He's a free agent. which, I mean, if they bring in Saquon, I think Singletary's probably out the door. And so he has everything to be, he's an every down back clearly. And with CJ, it might be a little bit of just like a fan pick, just for fantasy though, not even as being a Texans fan. Fantasy players, they want this to happen. I think he'll be getting every handoff. He'll get the catches with CJ around, and I love it. That's my take. I mean, obviously, we're gonna probably cross over on a lot of some of these guys. But where do you think he could land in a few weeks?
I love Houston. Obviously, would love for my Texans to absolutely get, say, Quads Barkley on the team. That'd be very nice. Looking at a couple other teams that are interesting, we're not really, I know the Patriots are a little bit questionable, but they're going to want to make a big free agency splash. Now that Bill Belichick is no longer there, playing GM, they're not going to be stingy, I don't feel like, to go after pretty good offensive players. I feel like the Patriots are probably going to want to rebuild, their culture, add some talent. So maybe Saquon Barkley could go to New England. A couple other teams that could be interesting. When you look at the Minnesota Vikings, Justin, they're an interesting team as far as, running backs. They do have pretty good wide receivers, of course, with Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison, who are pretty good. But, with the running backs, they struggled a little bit. Alexander Madison was poised to have a great running back season. He was very on and off. We did see, however, though, some flashes from Ty Chandler, Justin, towards the end of the year. But how reliable can Ty Chandler be, Justin, for that Minnesota Vikings team? This is a team right now that's still trying to convince Justin Jefferson, hey, this is a team to be with. Justin Jefferson's not 100% sold on staying with the Vikings. I feel like right now we're not really sure what they're going to do with Kirk Cousins. So maybe Saquon could go to Minnesota. I'm not sure the cap space situation. There's a couple other teams that could be in the hunt. We're not really sure with the Carolina Panthers if Chuba Hubbard and, Miles Sanders are it now. They've struggled. Maybe Dave Canales is going to want to have a star, studded running back behind their, franchise quarterback now, Bryce Young. But hey, would love for Saquon Barkley to come to Houston. That'd be great. There's many other teams right now that have their star running back like pretty solidified. The Raiders have Josh Jacobs, and the Chiefs, the reigning champs, have Pacheco, and the 49ers McCaffrey, and many teams have their star running back. We talked about Bijan. There's a lot of teams that have the running. Maybe the Bears could probably go for Saquon. But I guess the Texans makes the most sense just because they're going to be competing for the division. So hey, if Saquon Barkley comes join my Houston Texans, I'd be very happy. Very.
Yeah. I think I don't know. I know that's amongst the favorites for locations for where Saquon could land. I will say for Houston, I know Mike Evans has been rumored and Saquon has now been rumored. I don't know if they can bring in both guys. Probably could bring in one. I can see them bringing in none of them as well. But I do like Saquon the most for his landing spots. We'll move to RB2, a guy who we talked about earlier, Derrick Henry. I'm going to let you make your prediction first, and then I'll jump in.
I think Buffalo is a pretty interesting spot. Now that I'm thinking about it, Justin, look at it this way. The Bills, I know they have a pretty, good running back in James Cook, and we know how great Josh Allen can run the football. But I just feel like the Bills, they need a bruiser. They need someone that can move the ball. They play in a cold area. They go to New York and they go to New England once a year. That's, going to have weather conditions. They could go to Pittsburgh. They could go to Cleveland to play a game. They could go to Kansas City. Those teams, even teams like Denver, all those teams in the AFC, they get blizzards. They get snowstorms at the end of the year. So Josh Allen's going to sometimes need someone to rely to give the ball off. And, sometimes, if Derrick Henry goes to the Bills, maybe in the playoffs, he might get 20 to 25 carries a game. That's something that the Bills need. James Cook is great, but he's a speed back, Like I've mentioned multiple times, I've loved what the Detroit Lions done. Even though I've, talked bad about Dan Campbell, I do love the two-back set, where they have a sort of power back and a speed back. I do think that's something that maybe the NFL is leaning towards now. No longer that one, headed guy. So Buffalo would be nice to have Derrick Henry and James Cook. Looking at other teams here, maybe Denver. Justin, we're not really sure with Javonte Williams, excuse me, if he's going to be good. He is a great back, but is he going to be consistent as he was, his rookie year before he got hurt? Maybe the Bengals, Justin, can get him. We mentioned we're not
Yeah.
really sure about Joe Mixon, and Brown is more of a receiving back. If the Giants lose Saquon, maybe they go for Derrick Henry just at a reasonable price. Maybe he goes to Washington with Dan Quinn, or like I mentioned, Minnesota, I feel like is the number one team that's needing a running back the most. Maybe the Saints. We're not really sure if Kamara is that guy anymore. So there's many, teams out there, even Chicago, not really sure what they're going to do. So those are the couple teams, Justin, that I think the best fit is Buffalo or even Dallas. There's a lot of fits potentially for Derrick Henry. But if I had to pick one team, I think I'm going to go with Buffalo to land Derrick Henry.
The Bills is an interesting one. I know there's a number of options. I weighted down to 3, but I'm going to go with one. One of my top one that we actually talked about a couple weeks ago. I think Derrick Henry is set for Philadelphia. I think there were talks. I remember it clear as day.
Yeah.
There were talks about the Titans possibly moving him to Philly last year. Philly was trying to get that deal done. It didn't happen. But Henry now, being a free agent, could come join his buddy A.J. Brown, former Titan, in Philadelphia. If Tush Push gets banned, they might need another guy they can give it to instead of Jalen. And Derrick Henry's the best of them to do that. So I think Derrick Henry to Philadelphia, he'll finally have a good offensive line. I think that kind of lines up perfectly. Howie Roseman always gets to work with is good with working with money, trying to make a deal happen. So I think even if they have some cap issues, even though the cap is also going up by $8 million this year, so some more room for some players, and I think Derrick Henry kind of fits right with Philly. And then moving on to the third running back, we got Josh Jacobs, which unlike the last two guys, I think Josh Jacobs is staying in Las Vegas. I think he will be a Raider again. I think that the Raiders are going to finally have some juice together. They didn't have it under McDaniels, even though Jacobs did have his best season with McDaniels. We move on to another year, and I think, it's going to be tough for some of these running backs to get the contracts they really want, and I think that's going to lead some of them to staying put with their team, and I think Jacobs will fall under that just because he did fall off a little bit in a lot of efficiency ratings prior to his big year the year before, which is to be expected when you have such a career season that he had 2 years ago. Coming into this year, he did struggle more, but so did the team. Hopefully, they address quarterback in a good way as well. So, I say Josh Jacobs stays in Vegas. What do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. When you look at what Antonio Pierce is building in Las Vegas, I love it. I love how they were able to retain Antonio Pierce and give him the head coaching title. This coach is going to be pretty good for the Raiders. I'm so excited to see what he has in store. I feel like he's able to get the attention of the players and gets the best out of them. I love the way the Raiders end the season. But Josh Jacobs did have a pretty questionable ending to the season. He did get hurt for I think the 3 out of the 4 games of the year, Zamir White took over, had some great games. But I do love Josh Jacobs going into this year with a more stable culture. I think they'll pay him, and so he'll be more motivated to play. Going into this past season, he wasn't really a part of training camp and OTAs. He was fighting that contract, and you mentioned how he did have a great season under Josh McDaniels, but Josh McDaniels just wasn't the guy for them in Vegas. So now that they have their guy in Antonio Pierce, they're going to draft a quarterback for sure in Vegas, for sure, to go with that star-studded offense. I do believe he stays. And, Josh Jacobs is a pretty decent second to third round pick in fantasy drafts, Justin. I like Josh Jacobs. He's one of those guys that are going to get, looked over a little bit, kind of like how Nick Chubb did a couple years ago. And we love Josh Jacobs this year in Vegas.
Cool. Yeah. All right. So we're aligned there with Jacobs. We still think he's a pretty good back. He's not in that super wash category yet. But now moving on to another guy who also had a very good 2022. 2023 wasn't the same. We're talking about Tony Pollard here. He's a free agent. what are your thoughts? Do you think Dallas keeps him around, or is he moving on to a new squad?
Man, that is good. That's a good question. I'm gonna have to go on the no side, and it's very surprising to myself because I do think he does stay with Dallas, but part of me thinks that he doesn't. When you look at Dallas, they're now a pass-heavy first team now, and you have guys like Rico Dowdle and Deuce Vaughn, who's a little bit of a fan favorite in Dallas. He's a coach's son on there, and I think they might give him some good looks. If Dallas is able to get Derrick Henry as well, I do think they have a solid backfield with those two running backs I just mentioned. I feel like they probably won't even think of Pollard. Pollard had great expectations going this year, but I feel like Justin. I feel like when Ezekiel Elliott was there, I think Pollard had more of that hunger. To have big plays, a little bit of sense of urgency for Tony Pollard. But once he was able to get the starting job, I feel like he got a little too comfortable, and we saw Pollard struggle lots of games. He didn't really have those explosive runs as he did with those first couple years in Mike McCarthy's offense. I don't think Pollard's going to stay. I just have the feeling now that, Dallas is going to have to start, looking at what they're going to do with CeeDee Lamb and Micah Parsons, as we mentioned earlier. With Dallas, they can, develop offensive talent so well, whether it's with the running backs or with the receivers. So I don't think they miss much if they let Pollard walk. Knowing Jerry Jones, he loves to draft his gems in the third and fourth round anyway. So, who knows? Maybe Dallas can go, draft a running back to go along with Dowdle and Vaughn and potentially Derrick Henry. So I'm not really sure if Pollard stays. I don't think he will. I do think he's on a good fit, perhaps on a Cincinnati, maybe Justin, to provide that speed back. Maybe, teams like, I don't know, maybe the 49ers might take a plunge. Who knows? There's so many different ways Pollard can go. Maybe to New England, maybe to Buffalo, like I mentioned, maybe to the Giants, or even Washington. And so there's so many ways to do it. I don't think he stays in Dallas. So definitely not with Pollard in Dallas in 2024.
Yeah, I'm on the same board there. I do not think he stays. Washington is a good one that you bring up. I think they're definitely in the market of bringing in a veteran running back because Gibson is a free agent, which is important to point out. But I think he's going to go to the Los Angeles Chargers. I think that the time for Eckler in Los Angeles is over, unfortunately. And they're kind of depleted. Josh Kelly is also a free agent, so they only got Isaiah Spiller in the backfield, which he's an Aggie, but he has struggled in the NFL so far. With speed and stuff, but Pollard, he has some speed and has that juice, and they'll probably bring in two running backs, I think, to that backfield because it is clear that Pollard isn't the full workhorse back, which is fine. He's suited for a more less heavy workload, but he has he'll have more effective plays in a new offense, and I think. With Greg Roman, he is the offensive coordinator for the Chargers now. Even though his ways kind of fell out of success in Baltimore a handful of years ago, he was always pretty good at running the football. And so I think Pollard is a good match for the Chargers, and so I think that's where he'll go. Moving on to the next guy, Austin Eckler. Which if he's not, if they sign Pollard, I don't think they sign Eckler. And I foresee him going to a team you just mentioned, the Washington Commanders. I think he has. I mean, he definitely, again, another older running back, slowed down this past year, didn't look as great, as always. Dealt with injuries, which could be a turn away for a lot of teams. But I think Washington now, with Gibson being a free agent. He didn't really pan out either, but they do like Brian Robinson, so he's going to be there, and they're going to need a guy that can catch the ball, and I think Eckler's going to be their guy on a cheaper deal because Eckler's not he's not going to command too much, being near 30. But I like Eckler being there. It could be that would be one of the best duos in football behind Gibbs and Montgomery. And so I think that's a spot for Eckler to head to. Do you have any thoughts on where Eckler will land?
That's pretty tough. I I kind of like Carolina. When you look at what the Panthers are going to do this year, they have a pretty good coach who has potential to be a good coach to call great, play calls. You know how he elevated Baker Mayfield's career, and how he did for Geno. So I feel like for the Panthers now, they want to build offensively and add some weapons around Bryce Young. And I think they're going to look at it in the running back position as well as wide receivers. And, Eckler is a great, pass catcher at the backfield. I think his time is done in LA. I feel like his mojo's kind of staled out. And I feel like with Jim Harbaugh, he's going to want to add some different talent as, Jim Harbaugh has always been able to elevate, different players. So I do think they do walk from Eckler. And I do like Eckler on Carolina, as weird as it sounds. Another team that I like him on is Cincinnati. I know I mentioned, Chase Brown earlier, how he has that Eckler type, feel and the potential to have that type of, playmaking skills for Cincinnati. But, if they can pay cheap for Eckler and get another back around Joe Burrow, I would like that. I would like to see that. Maybe Washington, but I like Washington and Carolina. I feel like there's going to be other teams that'll probably overpay for Saquon and Derrick Henry. So I feel like that leaves, Eckler, like to get, the second options around whatever team didn't get those two running backs. I feel Eckler would probably fall into that category and with probably those couple other teams. But I do like Carolina, maybe Washington, and Cincinnati for Austin Eckler.
Yeah, and he's talented. We saw, before this year, he was he was one of the best running backs in the league, and hopefully some teams don't forget that. I don't think that's totally gone in a way. So I like what you're saying. A good veteran receiving back for Bryce Young could be super valuable, for him for his second season. Now I want to jump into a last few guys. We're running a little long on time, so we're going to run through these guys pretty fast. I want to see your prediction on J.K. Dobbins coming off of, it was an Achilles tear. He's been coming off just so many injuries. Will Baltimore bring him back, or is he headed somewhere new? What are your thoughts?
I think that's his only option right now, Justin. I think, I don't think there's so many running backs to go around in this league, Justin. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing J.K. Dobbins on any other team but the Ravens, a team who's familiar with him. But, many things happen along the NFL season. Running backs get hurt, just like we saw with Nick Chubb, how, heartbreaking that was as he went out like week 1 or week 2. So, if J.K. Dobbins doesn't end up with the Ravens, if they just waive him, I don't think J.K. Dobbins goes to the team, immediately. I feel like he's one of those guys they call up maybe from a practice squad and, a star running back gets hurt just because of the amount of injuries J.K. Dobbins has in this league. It's very unfortunate if a running back tears their ACL in back-to-back years. It's pretty much, a slow, road to recovery, a slow road to be back in the NFL as a starting running back. It's so unfortunate. We all love J.K. Dobbins. I loved him at the University of Ohio State. He was so good in his first couple years in the league. And then, he had a, ACL tear and then, he tore his Achilles again. He had back-to-back, devastating injuries. We're always so high on J.K. Dobbins, but I'm not really sure if another team picks him up besides Baltimore. I do think Baltimore should just keep him and see where they have with them. Just because he was never really bad. He never had bad games. He just, had 2 season-ending injuries, which is so difficult to come back from. My heart feels for him, but I do believe he's back on the Ravens. If he's on another team, I feel like it's only because, kind of like what happened with the Rams this year, when Connor Williams, went out and they brought back Darrell Henderson and they had a couple other running backs on the roster. So something like that I feel like could be in the market for J.K. Dobbins, but not on any team immediately just because of the injuries.
Yeah, I definitely want to preface these last 4 guys. I think they're kind of guys that won't be they won't be signed to be, the next starter, the next workhorse back for next season. And Dobbins falls in that category where he's coming off a big injury, which already puts him back as to having a big year. And so I think he will. I think he will stay in Baltimore, or he's going to sign that like small 1-year prove it deal with like the Vikings per se. I know the Vikings are always. It seems to be that they are trying to save some money. So bringing in Dobbins on a cheap deal, on an opportunity to be their next top running back. I think the Vikings, or I like the Ravens as well. Moving to the next guy, A.J. Dillon. Hasn't panned out in Green Bay. He had definitely a lot of people had high hopes, including myself, that he could kind of be a touchdown machine. It's never happened. He can surprisingly catch the ball from time to time. I think he has a better market than J.K. Dobbins will, but I don't think he stays in Green Bay. He's probably going to find a team that needs a running back that can kind of be a bruiser, which I think could be the Buffalo Bills. They got Cook, but they tried Latavius Murray and they tried Leonard Fournette, and it never really. It was fine. It was fine. I'll leave with it was fine. Dillon, though, if he gets some good coaching, he can maybe evolve a little bit more and be that that big time scorer. Maybe the Packers were holding him back a little with scoring, but I mean they had Aaron Jones, and so if he goes to Buffalo, he could kind of be a guy that they want to use more often in scoring situations. So you have any thoughts on Dillon?
I like Dillon to go. I agree with you to maybe to Buffalo or maybe Tennessee. I feel like, Tajay Spears goes up in the depth chart. They probably need a little bit of that Derrick Henry-esque presence. They need a little bit of a bruiser, a little bit of a, bulldozer of a running back. So maybe he goes to Tennessee. Justin, I do think he's not in Green Bay anymore. Justin, in those 7 to 8 games that Aaron Jones missed, A.J. Dillon did not have much impressive games. He had the workload in front of him, wasn't able to capitalize. Aaron Jones was hurt for the most part of the year. That's why it was so surprising to see Aaron Jones have a great game in Dallas in Wild Card Weekend. So it was really disappointing to, see A.J. Dillon not able to produce when, Aaron Jones was missing games. So I feel like that lowers his value. So I feel like a team like Tennessee signs him for a good deal. Maybe Buffalo signs him for a good deal. I don't think he's a very hot commodity for, as far as running backs. I feel like you can look better in the draft. But there's only a few teams I like A.J. Dillon on just because he was not successful with Aaron Jones being out. But I have to pick a team. It'd definitely be Tennessee. I like him in Tennessee. I feel like they get him on a fairly deal. And I think he'd be pretty decent with the Titans.
I like the Titans, actually. As a good play. They're probably going to want to replace Derrick Henry with another big back, and he could be a good guy there. Now we're going to jump to the last two guys. Zach Moss, who had a very interesting season where he actually played very well, kind of revitalized his career, and then Devin Singletary, who also I think surpassed a lot of people's expectations. Let's see here. This is kind of to me at a point I'll probably see Zach Moss returning to the Colts, being that good. 1B. I mean, he's more. I mean, he is a 2 as they showed Jonathan Taylor as the season progressed, got all the touches, but I think he'd be a good backup. And then Singletary, I'll get your thoughts after I just say them quickly both. And Singletary, I do think Saquon is a Texan, so I do think Singletary will unfortunately leave, even though he played very well for the Texans. Unless they get rid of a guy like Pierce. If they get rid of Pierce, maybe they bring back both, but paying 2 running backs probably isn't in the Texans' side. So Singletary, I think there's a handful of spots you can go. I like the Giants. I like the Giants, kind of a swap there. Saquon coming to Houston, Devin Singletary to the Giants. Time will tell, but there's not really a ton of things. I think Singletary, if he goes to the Giants, he won't be super exciting. They'll probably bring in a draft day running back too, and it won't be. I don't think it'll be super fun. If Saquon's not in New York, I don't think that Giants backfield's going to be super enticing to say. What do you have for both guys?
So for Zach Moss, I would like to see him in Arizona. I feel like Arizona this past year had a big injury scare with James Conner. He was able to come back and finish strong. But I do think, Arizona needs another back there. I think Zach Moss would work wonderful with the Cardinals. Zach Moss is very sneaky. He was all right in Buffalo, but man, in Indianapolis this year, man, he was really running and gunning for Jonathan Taylor's spot. Obviously, Jonathan Taylor is a star running back. We know he's going to be great going into next year. However, I like Zach Moss in Arizona. I think he fits that area better. Maybe he goes to Chicago, maybe a Washington. I like him best in Arizona. As far as Singletary, I'm not really sure. I'm not the biggest Singletary fan. He has flashes here and there. If I had to say a team for Singletary, I do agree with you. I think it's like a swap. He goes to the Giants. Um, maybe he goes to the Saints. I'm not really sure what they're going to do at running back. Is Jamal Williams going to stay? Is Kamara going to be consistent? Do they like the rookie out of TCU, who's I think is Williams, Kendrick Williams? So I'm not really sure. Singletary is good, not great, but I definitely the Texans need to upgrade at running back. If it's not Saquon, it needs to be a bruiser. Maybe look into the draft. Maybe elevate Dameon Pierce. There's many different ways the Texans need to go. I'm not really sure if keeping Singletary is the right way to go. But hey, maybe Singletary goes to Indianapolis if Zach Moss leaves. So there's many different ways to go about it. Singletary, not really on my hot list for free agents. Maybe he can go under the radar and be a pretty decent RB2.
Yeah, I think anywhere he goes, we want to be not super excited for. I will say, if Saquon is not a Texan, I do think they bring Singletary back. If they don't sign Saquon, I think Singletary will be brought back, and will be the same kind of guy he was at the end of the season, which could be a solid fantasy pick. I think that's Singletary's best case scenario, in my opinion. But yeah, that kind of closes out our free agency predictions for running backs. We'll dive in definitely more. I mean, free agency's in a few weeks. We'll handle all of that. Next week is going to be a receiver day, a receiver episode. But right in the middle of that, this weekend, we're doing the mock draft, 2-round NFL mock draft. Our first one, we'll have another one before, the draft goes on. But I just want to put that out there. We have another episode this week at our new, little studio we got going on here, talking online for Dween Sports. But yes, our running back episode is complete. We talked about performance reviews. We talked about free agency running backs. We'll dive into some draft running backs as the weeks go on. But, we got that running backs on lock. Quarterbacks last week, receivers next week, and then we'll dive into a lot more free agency stuff as it'll be starting, as well as the combine is starting on the 26th. So draft is right around the corner. Franchise tag is open. So just so much news is going to be coming out of the next few weeks. We're very excited. But yeah, I just want to say thank you, Dween Nation. Continue to share, support, subscribe, comment, everything. We want it all from you guys. And we can't wait to provide more and hear more from you guys. So that's all from me. Genoa, send us out.
Dween Nation, we love you guys. We're going to keep this off season as exciting as we can. We're so excited for the draft, free agency, and what better place, Justin, to come here and listen to Dween Nation. We're so excited, man. And hey, join us next week for receivers because this episode is going to be interesting. It's a receiver-driven lead, and it's going to be interesting to talk about, Justin, especially for that mock draft. Can't wait.
I cannot wait for the mock draft. I've been all over that. But yes, all right, Dween Nation, y'all have a good day and peace.